India will not progress until bad people die. When I was little, I would sit on the stairs of my backyard, so this man whose house is opposite to ours would stand in front of me, sticking his penis out. I didn't understand if this was good or bad. One day, when I was sitting on the stairs, my neighbor's son also sat on his stairs. Suddenly, this man started telling him to go away. I was thinking, why is he saying that? Because he does this whenever I sit there. And today, when that boy was also sitting there, why was he acting this way? Then, another time, when he started to do this, I called my mom. The minute I said, "Mommy," he ran away. That time, I understood that he was doing something he should not do. Then, he built his house, his first floor and second floor. After that, whenever he came to his balcony, I avoided going out. But sometimes, when I'm doing some work in the backyard of my house, like washing clothes or putting the clothes on the cloth line, this man stares at me and takes his tongue out and licks his lip from his balcony, which creeps me out. Then I have to pretend to call my mom or dad. Then he will quickly close his door and go inside. And he is even married. He has a son and a daughter, and their daughter is 3 years older than me. Never trust any man, as some of them wear a mask of innocence in front of their loved ones, but they are evil from the inside. I'm thinking I should tell my parents to install a CCTV camera in the backyard, but there's no law that will punish him for this behavior. India will be a good place to live in if these type of people die quickly. When I was younger, I lived in a small house. One afternoon, my sister and younger brother and I were home alone while our parents were at work and my other siblings were not home yet. It was daytime and I was hanging out in my sister's room. My sister was on the computer and I was drawing. This is still when dial-up was a thing. My brother was in the living room. I was getting hungry, so I decided to head to the kitchen for a snack. As I walked down the hallway and past my room, I suddenly froze. There, hanging from the ceiling fan in my room, was a figure with a noose around its neck. What the actual fuck? Its head bowed and shrouded in black. I was overwhelmed by an icy chill and could not physically move. I blinked so many times. I'm like, surely this is not real. I closed my eyes. I'm thinking what I'm seeing is fake. When I opened my eyes, the figure was still there, hanging. I turned my head to look away. When I looked back, it was finally gone. Still shaken, I didn't know what I just processed. I walked to the kitchen. I saw my brother in the living room, thinking I should tell him. But he's younger. I didn't want to scare him. Confused and terrified, I kept the sight to myself, convincing myself It was just my imagination. That same night, I faced my fears and slept in my room. Our house is small, and I shared a room with my other sister. I avoided sleeping near the ceiling fan. I slept closer to the wall. I practically hugged the wall and slept where I only faced the wall. I reassured myself that it was nothing and that I was safe. I finally drifted to sleep. The next morning, as I was groggily waking up, my mom barged into my room with a pair of scissors. Without saying much, she had cut the rope I had added to the ceiling fan's pull lever, which I had used because I was too short to reach it. That's where it was hanging from. My parents' native tongue is Vietnamese. My mom simply said one word in Vietnamese: scary. Her reaction suggested she had seen something too. For context, I lived near a cemetery. I think this is the reason why it was there. We moved out of that house. For some odd reason, I thought about it again today. Now, it's just a distant memory. I think I encountered a ghost as a kid. I think I was 5 or 6 when this happened. I was sleeping beside my mom. My dad was supposed to come back home from work late that night. My dad was supposed to come home somewhere around 1 or 2 a.m. Mind you, it was winter, hence it wasn't very windy, and the windows were closed, and obviously the fan wasn't on. I was a light sleeper as a kid, hence I understood what was happening. When my dad entered, he greeted me and asked me if I was pretending to sleep. He said he brought my favorite chocolates. I giggled and said, "Yes, I am." Well, I think what I did was wrong. The next moment, my mom came in the room, saying the doorbell wasn't ringed by my dad. In fact, someone seemed to have ringed it. I obviously didn't think much of it because I was a little kid, but I kept on wondering what I saw. Who asked me if I was asleep or not? I freaked out a minute after the above thought came to my mind, and I told my mother, who obviously thought I was joking because I was a kid. Then I think I fell asleep, but now I got scared. My mother was fast asleep. I felt something caress my face. I didn't dare to look up, but then I heard the sound of a hanger falling. It was supposed to be on the closet. I looked up and saw nothing. I looked at my mother and saw that she was fast asleep. Then the bell rang again. This time I peed my fucking self. And I sadly don't remember what happened next. I grew up in a small town in Australia. My twin brother and I would frequently ride our bikes around the neighborhood when we were growing up around the late 2000s and early 2010s. And there was this one house that we'd pass that would always leave us at unease. A weird and deranged looking man would sit on a camping chair and drink on the side of the road outside of his house, in which all of the grass surrounding his yard was extremely overgrown and unkept. We thought nothing of it. However, we always felt the same sense of dread whenever we'd ride past. Several years later, around 2017, there was a news article that 2 men had gotten into a fight resulting in one of them being stabbed to death. The mugshot that came up on the news showed the man we had always found creepy. It happened in that same neighborhood that we'd frequently ride past, around a block or two away from mine. It might not seem like much, but it has always made my skin crawl, knowing I came face to face with that deranged psychopath on multiple occasions, and that I lived only a walk away. I still live there, but I have heard nothing more of it. I hope he is locked up for life. This was a few years back, but from time to time, I still have an eerie feeling. For background, I sleep in my son's room in a separate bed as he has autism and needs me in the night a lot. When he was a toddler, I had him in a toddler bed with that half-guard rail thing. He would wake up in the middle of the night and crawl on the floor giggling because he knew he was being a sneaky little bugger. So, one night, I had a feeling like someone sat on the edge of my bed. I turned over and saw my son crawling around on the floor, like he usually does. So I told him, "Get back in bed," and literally, as soon as I said that, I heard a snore. I looked back over at his bed, and he is lying there asleep. I looked back to the floor, and nothing was there. The update to this. Now my son is older. I used to feel the something is sitting on the edge of my bed feeling all the time. Then it stopped for like several years. But recently, I've been feeling that something has been sitting on the edge of my bed again recently. I reside in a village close to a tiny forest with very slender trees. Around the age of 12, a close friend and I were frolicking in a field by a small forest. We simply strolled around and interacted with sticks we discovered, either hitting them against rocks or trees. We approached the forest we had been to countless times. Being there was not out of the ordinary for us. We discussed various topics and casually bumped into every tree we passed as usual until both of us halted simultaneously. There was an object ahead of us, approximately 10 to 15 meters in distance. I was surprised, but not frightened. Initially, I mistook it for a boar due to its pig-like nose. However, upon closer examination, its body resembled that of a German shepherd. However, if that wasn't strange already, it proceeded to move behind a slender tree, as mentioned previously, and simply vanished. It hadn't gone so far behind the tree that it was out of sight from where I was standing. It simply scrolled behind the tree and never emerged on the opposite side. After observing it for about 10 seconds, I asked my friend, "Did you catch that?" Another 5 seconds went by with no response from him. I looked back and witnessed him running as he had never run before. I became anxious and began to flee from the forest. We reached the field and looked back, but it was still nowhere in sight. Still unaware of what it was. If it had been an animal, it likely would have fled due to the loud noises we produced earlier. I continue to reside at that same place, but have never come across that thing again. Occasionally, I listen to peculiar sounds coming from the forest and the field during the late night hours. It was Halloween 2015. My daughter was 8 at the time and not excited to trick or treat at all. She kept saying, "Mom, I have a bad feeling. Something bad is going to happen." I kept trying to reassure her that it was just nerves, especially since there were a lot of clown costumes that year, and she's not a fan. So we met up with my sister and her 2 kids to trick or treat in her neighborhood. We did see a few clowns riding four-wheelers, so I said to my daughter, "See, that's what you were worried about. But it's just kids dressed up." We finished up trick-or-treating with my sister and drove home, stopping at a gas station briefly. We had pulled into a designated parking spot, and a car was parked near us, but with their rear end facing my daughter's passenger back door where she was seated. All of a sudden, this lady drives in reverse, backing directly into my daughter's door, and our entire car moves. I'm like, what the hell? And now my daughter is screaming and crying. I get out of the car and check on my kid to make sure she has no injuries. She's okay, but upset. Then this crazy lady of the other car takes 2 young boys out of her car, whom are barefoot and in PJs, and she's screaming at me not to call the cops. Obviously, I dialed 911, and while I was waiting for their arrival, this lady takes the 2 boys and goes into a bar across the street. The cops show up, and I say, "She went into that bar over there with 2 children. She must have called someone, and they told her to return to the scene of the accident." So she comes back, and we are yelling at each other. And who shows up but my ex-boyfriend? Yes, he is now dating this crazy lady. She hit my car so hard that it had to be realigned and the whole 9 yards. I didn't think she had car insurance the way she was acting and screaming not to call the cops. The whole way home, my daughter said, "See, Mom, I told you something bad was going to happen." She was right, and I will never dismiss her feelings again. She is 17 now, and absolutely hates Halloween, and refused from then on to trick or treat. I grew up going to a Christian church from birth. It was very small and family-like. We loved it as kids. In 2008, I was about 9 years old. We found out that someone had committed suicide in our church. It was super strange and unexpected for the church people. A few months later, we found out that the pastor's wife passed away. He beat her and tried to stage it as a car accident. When she passed away, our pastor threw her a memorial service at the church. On that Sunday, me and my family showed up to support him and her family. You know how at funerals people stand in a line and you usually walk up and hug them? It was the same thing here. We would walk away and give our respects, and I hugged him. He got away with it for over a year before people started questioning the whole situation. The whole time, he was still preaching in our church and just continuing on with his life. So, fast forward a little, and people find out my pastor killed his wife. But then, some people started questioning the death of his first wife from 1999. This man killed two wives. He got away with the first and almost got away with the second. The person who committed suicide, we later found out he killed himself because the pastor was also having an affair with another member of the church who was also married. I was not only close to this man, but I slept in the same house as him on our Bible retreats. This is super creepy, and it makes me have a lot of trust issues. When I was younger, me and my two friends always slept over at one of their apartment complexes. One of them lived in a neighborhood with a big white clubhouse that could be rented out for parties, birthdays, and so on. We went by the house multiple times when walking to the pool and always got an eerie vibe from it. One time we were walking laps around the pool house, and my friend said the chair that we could see through the window had moved from earlier, which was weird. And a few weeks later, as we were walking to the pool, we saw a strange man lurking around the house. Coming back from the pool, we saw the door was cracked open. That night, we decided we wanted to investigate, so we snuck out and went to the house. There was a really strange vibe. As we walked there, something fell out of a tree. It was a featherless bird that had their eyes ripped out and was bleeding all over the sidewalk. We were so freaked out. We walked to the back of the house and saw a room with lights on. As I looked up, I saw a chubby man chopping something with a butcher knife in the window. I was frozen. Suddenly, my friend's mom came and grabbed us and took us home. The time was around midnight. As we went home, she told us she also felt something was off about that house. This is one of those unexplainable stories. It still scares me to this day. I worked as an overnight grocery stocker for 19 years. This happened about 15 years ago. We were working on one of the nights where we didn't have a load and were just doing back stock. Once a week, one of our meat department employees would stay late and do deep cleaning. It was Mary's turn this week. It was a bit after midnight when Mary came up to me in tears, all shooken up. She was telling me there was a man, all dressed in black, standing in the meat department, motioning for her to go to him. I grabbed another one of my employees to go look for this guy. We looked everywhere, but didn't see anyone. I reassured Mary we looked everywhere, but didn't see anyone else in the store. But I still felt a bit uneasy about the whole thing. Our closing manager always does a walkthrough to make sure no one is left in the store. Mary went back to work, but just a few minutes later, she came back up to me in panic mode, telling me he was back and motioning for her to come to him. Once again, we went looking around and didn't see anyone there. I told Mary she could go home and not worry about finishing her work. That morning, when the store manager came in, I told her what had happened. She pulled up the camera footage and saw nothing weird. She told me that Mary told her a strange story a few nights before about a customer with a knife. We just thought maybe it was just Mary having too much stress. The next night, I went into work and was told Mary had passed away that morning. She went home from work, went to bed, and never woke up. It still runs through my mind to this day. The weirdest thing that ever happened on my midnight shift. My family and I live in an apartment in a large city. I sleep on a fairly large bed left behind by the previous tenants. One morning, I was woken up by the sound of rice being rinsed with water. We eat rice for breakfast. I wasn't wearing my glasses. My eyesight is quite terrible. And I saw what looked like a woman with long dark hair on the edge of my bed, looking down at me. I assumed that it was my mom, either getting something or fixing my pillow or whatever. I turned around and went back to sleep. Then I realized something. My mom is the only person who would be rinsing rice in the morning. So that would mean that she's in the kitchen. My father and brother both have short hair, and they should still be asleep right now. Then, who did I just see? I immediately turned back around, only to see that my bedroom was empty. Over a number of years, I had sleep paralysis. It started in my room when I was 13. I felt a bad presence, things like a breeze in an enclosed room, and a flag I had on the wall lifting up. This was when I lost some loved ones in a short space of time. When I was 16, I started getting sleep paralysis and seeing a black figure in the dark corners of my room. For years it stayed in the same place. Over time, my sleep paralysis got worse, and a few instances stuck out. I moved to another city for university and woke up one night with the shadow on my chest sitting on me. I could barely breathe and felt like I was fighting against its presence. On another occasion, I awoke, but this time it was beside the bed, reaching over to me to get to me. I managed to throw my arm to fight it and heard the most demonic growl ever. After that, I never got sleep paralysis again or have seen the shadow again. I have faith that I defeated it that night. I also pray every night. I hear the same scream every night. I live on the third floor of my apartment complex, which is immediately beside a small local private elementary school, to the point I can see their playground by my window. Since mine is the last apartment of the highway, and I have been disturbed by their noise during recess. It first started when I was watching Longlegs a few weeks ago with my boyfriend, who was sleeping over. And if you've seen this movie, you know it involves kids, especially girls. And during the movie, we heard this very quick, high-pitched scream that sounded like a little girl. We stopped the movie pretty troubled since we both heard the scream and it didn't feel like it came from the direction of the laptop, which made us think if we should call the cops in case there was an actual little girl in need of help nearby. But on my block, there are no other houses or residential buildings, so we didn't know how to make it make sense. So we just kept watching the movie, and only the next day we remembered about the school by my building. And ever since then, every night between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., I hear this same female childish scream that lasts for about a second. Last night, my boyfriend slept over again, and we both heard the scream again, and I confirmed it with him. Did you hear it? To which he said yes. And I just heard it again as I'm writing this. Sometimes I can just brush it off and go to sleep, but some days I am genuinely terrified. Should I be scared? Should I do anything? Check with my neighbors if they've heard something like this? Talk to the school, or just try to keep my cool and go back to sleep? This happened some time ago. I live in a town called Prijedor in Bosnia. One night in July, I was riding a bike when a bearded guy stopped me and started speaking with me. He seemed nice, so I continued talking. At the end, he said he was gonna introduce me to his daughter. Weird, but I thought he was joking. Then I didn't see him again until November. Me and my friend Amir were walking to the local convenience store. Then the bearded guy saw us and called us into his home to warm up since it was snowing. His house was the house where one old man lived, so I went, because I thought he was his son. He confirmed he was the son of that man, but that his father went on vacation and he was taking care of the house while his father was away. I recognized the granddaughter of the old man, so I was relieved. I thought this was just a friendly man and not some psychopath. We continued to the convenience store, and as we were heading back, we saw Amir's girlfriend, who drove us back. As we were driving, two police cars passed us. Then we saw three police cars parked in front of the house of the old man. The old man was on vacation, and his daughter and two granddaughters stayed to take care of the house. The thing is, he had two daughters and no sons. That man came into their house and threatened them to pretend like they were his family. The daughter took a chance while he was out and called the police. Unfortunately, it didn't end there. Later that night, I heard bangs on my door. I saw him through the window. He was yelling something, but I didn't hear what. I called the police, but he escaped. Last month, I found out he was arrested. He was a member of a religious Salafi cult. They are unfortunately present in high numbers in Bosnia. He was framed for assault and pedophilia, married a minor. I have now fully recovered from this traumatic event. Let me start this by saying this was many years ago. However, this is exactly how everything happened in my memory. At the time of this memory, I must have been about 5 years old. I remember coming home from preschool and going to Blockbuster. For those of you younger than me, that was a place you would go to rent DVDs and VHS tapes when streaming services didn't exist yet. We rented Nanny McPhee for me, and my mom and dad also rented a movie that I wasn't allowed to watch with them. Going to Blockbuster was a normal thing for my family. We usually went 2 to 3 times a week to rent movies. After that, my memory gets foggy and I don't remember exactly what happens. But I remember my mom kissing me goodnight once I went to bed. I was a stereotypical boy who had a race car bed when I was little, and I had lots of stuffed animals. From my memory, I remember having a pastel multicolored dolphin, a cheetah. My mom got it for me. She was a respiratory therapist and worked in the cheetah program, which is a critical care ambulance service at UW-Madison. A large Scooby-Doo plushie, many kitten plushies that came in a pack that my grandma brought me for Christmas, and a life-sized Spider-Man stuffed animal, which had glow-in-the-dark eyes. Every night when I went to sleep, I'd choose a few stuffed animals to keep in my bed with me. I don't remember what I chose that night, but I know I didn't choose Spider-Man because I remember staring at his glowing eyes across the room as I was falling asleep. My mom kissed me goodnight and shut the door. I dozed off and fell asleep, but I ended up waking up. I remember opening my eyes and still seeing Spider Man's eyes on the other side of the room, so I thought it hadn't been too long since I fell asleep. I stared at Spider Man's eyes and tried to fall back asleep. As I was staring into his eyes rose upwards and froze. Spider Man had to have been about 3 feet tall when I saw him standing, and I could tell he was standing by himself at this point. From there, the eyes started moving towards me. Obviously, being 5 years old, I screamed. I screamed bloody murder. I don't think I ever screamed that loud in my life. And a few seconds later, my mom came bursting into my room. As my mom burst into the door and the light bled into the room, the Spider-Man toy dropped to the floor. It had been about 4 to 5 feet from my bed, and it was walking. But as the light of the hallway hit it, it froze and hit the ground. Both my mom and I saw Spider-Man hit the ground as she opened the door, and she ran into the room and asked me what happened. I told her everything, and she immediately grabbed Spider-Man from the middle of my room and took him away. When she came back, she brought her laptop, and we watched the Nanny McPhee DVD that we had rented, and my mom slept in my room that night. That night actually started a trend of me and my mom having movie nights in my room, here and there, and where we would rent movies and watch them in my room on her laptop, making popcorn and eating candy that we brought from Blockbuster when we rented the movie. We had a garage sale a month or two later, and my mom and dad ended up selling Spider-Man at the garage sale. They also sold Scooby-Doo at the yard sale, and I remember being very upset about that because I loved Scooby. I never saw Spider-Man again, but even as a kid, I was thankful for that. After this experience, Spider-Man scared me. This was probably the most vivid memory of my childhood, and one of the only memories I have of my parents together before they got divorced when I was 6. After school, I had classes which I hated to attend. It was for English. We were reading the novel Life of Pi. The entire school was empty. Only one class was occupied in the second block. After an hour or so, the teacher sent us for a 15-minute break to buy something to eat and drink. So literally everyone goes outside of the school because there's a truck shop right across. However, I didn't go as I really needed to pee. So I headed for the teachers' bathrooms because they were the cleanest bathrooms in the whole school. So I go alone, and I was humming a random made-up song in my head. I go to the toilet, but when I do, I hear someone humming the exact same tune outside. I could hear it coming from afar, and that startled me. I didn't know if I should say anything or not. I decided to keep quiet. I rushed out as my adrenaline was pumping, but I saw no one. There was no one in the corridor. I was there alone. I've read about demonic stuff, so I guess I was kind of freaked out because I was thinking that there was a demon mimicking me. So I kept my head down and walked as fast as I could to the next class. Ever since that day, I have never visited the bathroom alone again, ever. My best friend lives in Ohio, and we have a summer tradition where every year I fly up and we go to Cedar Point Amusement Park in Sandusky. It's always a whole day affair for us, and after closing, we make the long drive back to her house. My friend has astigmatism, which makes it hard for her to drive at night. So I'm always the one that drives us back to the house. I was in the Medina area. I stopped at a red light. Something ran right in front of my car, over the crosswalk, and I was so scared and baffled. I'll do my best to describe it. It had short front legs, but far longer back legs that looked rather arched. The body, part of the creature was almond shaped, angled downward, and covered with brown fur. It ran too quickly for me to make out any kind of face. I started freaking out and told my friend to look, but she was scrolling on her phone and totally missed it. I'm a graveyard nerd. It's quiet there, and there's beautiful landscaping. It's a great place to take reflective walks. One day it was very hot, and I wanted to sit down. The closest thing besides the ground was a crypt that sat alone in the fork of one of the paths. I very respectfully said, "Please, may I sit here and rest a while?" As I climbed on top, almost immediately, I felt two knocks underneath me. I told myself it's just my imagination. I hear two more knocks. I say out loud, "I mean you no disrespect. Knock twice if you want me to leave." It hesitated. Then two distinct hard knocks hit me right in the bum where I sat. I said, "Okay, okay, I'm going." Another time, I went near dark. I've walked through the children's section many times. I've seen the toys people have placed on the children's graves. Some of them look 50 plus years old. This night, I didn't just walk past them. I stopped and thanked them all for coming here and trying to fulfill their destiny in some way, and told them I'm sorry it was cut short. As soon as I said rest in peace, one of those old decrepit toys began to flash little lights and play music. My significant other noped all the way to the car. I actually stayed and tried to talk, but nothing else happened. My last story. I went to a different graveyard this time, in an old Moravian graveyard with graves as far back as the 1500s. Maybe earlier, but I couldn't read them all. This graveyard has huge hills with mausoleums tucked into the halls. I sat on top of one and looked out over the whole place. Very serene. I sat up there and watched a fox spinning in circles way down at the bottom of the hill. He acted confused, like he had rabies. I wasn't going to move until he left, so I waited. A woman came from somewhere I didn't even know where because I couldn't see the whole place. She walked towards a grave near where this fox was just spinning around. I got worried for her and stood up to scream down to her that there was a rabid fox and to run away. But when I stood up, she wasn't there anymore. I waited for the fox to show themselves again, but they were gone too. Just like that. Gone. I very cautiously climbed down. I went down the hill to where I saw all this happen. No woman, no fox. Nothing but quiet graves and beautiful flowers. This happened in a basement apartment I lived in with my significant other years ago. A huge house converted into apartments that, in the 1800s, was a school. The first encounter I paid attention to was when my guy was going down the steps to the basement. I was behind him. As he stepped down to the last one, something kicked his right foot and he fell flat on his spine on the steps. Later, I began to see shadow creatures climb up the walls. They looked like spider shapes. One night, I fell asleep early and he was watching TV. He said the tea light candles on top of the TV cabinet suddenly engulfed into flames for no reason. He grabbed them and threw them in the sink. He turned on the water. The flames shot up so high like gasoline was poured onto them and almost burned the kitchen down before he got a handle on it. I woke up to him pale white, sweating and shaking. I guess the thing knew we had no exit because the flames blocked the only door. Months later, I saw a massive change in my significant other. He has blue eyes, but they would turn black, and he started threatening to beat my skull in with a hammer, completely out of character with those black eyes. He was scared to death. He says he felt possessed. I decided to try to make contact. I put a mirror on the floor, dripped water on it, and turned off all the lights. I lit a candle and waited. 2 minutes in, some blue dots with red centers began to float up and all around the basement. He freaked out and begged to turn on the lights. I kept going. I asked who or what it was. The dots formed into one big orb that floated around the ceiling. I followed it into the bathroom and closed the door. My guy was having a heart attack. I talked to the orb, but nothing answered, and it disappeared. Years later, after we had moved, he was in the area for work and stopped to talk to a local pastor just down the road from the old house. He said hundreds of people died in the 1800s from tuberculosis in that location. They used the old schoolhouse to store the dead bodies until they could figure out what to do with them all. This was about 6 years ago. I was an extremely lonely and depressed freshman. The thing is, when you are alone, and depressed with a determined personality, you really struggle with yourself. You also find yourself depending on games, food, social media, and talking to yourself as nicely as possible to get through these things. I was really far from home and just knew I had to try and stay positive. I even started getting interested in spirituality and witchcraft. Then I started getting hyper realistic dreams where you are still groggy and drowsy but see weird stuff. This is one of my creepiest experiences. I remember being in a dream with weird rooms. Uh, think about how when you see the layout of a room and somewhat recognize it, but there is something off, like there is something missing. My dorm room was emptier than it should have been. It was more beige. I remember leaving the room. The hallway was different too. There were plants and windows that don't make sense architecturally for that building. Along the inside of the building, not the outside. I don't know why, but then as I was walking, I just blanked, like as if I fainted. I woke up, but in another bed. The room was more grayish blue. The door was open. The room looked similarly laid out like a dorm room. The blanket was blue instead of my rainbow quilt. I felt something moving around me, so I kept my eyes semi-closed. Out of the slit, when I felt more silence, I saw something dark brown, tall, gangly, and covered in coarse fur moving around outside the room. They came back, and as I lied there, I felt the creature pick me up. I don't know how, but they didn't know I was awake because I was just still. Too much time passed. I felt like I was going to pass out from fear. I opened my eyes a bit around the end. He was sort of quick with lying me back down into the original bed I was in. Then he just turned, and through my tired eyes I saw he had weird hair on his head shaped in a crescent or horns. I didn't see ears or a face. Once he left, I did go back to sleep. Not a word I remember, but it's funny that I do remember a deep voice at some point. I know it was their voice. I just couldn't comprehend what he was saying. I woke up normally, feeling weirded out, but safe still. A few days ago, I was sitting with my parents in their house. Suddenly, the topic turned to paranormal things because recently something strange has been happening to my mother. My mother began reminding my father of the time when we, including my sister, were walking to my grandmother's house one evening. I was the youngest then, only 6 years old. A woman dressed in white, holding a bowl in her hands, appeared in front of the four of us. We all froze in that moment. The woman in her white dress was floating in the air, and her legs weren't visible beneath the dress. She quickly turned toward the wheat field beside us, and we could see the waves in the wheat as she moved through it. My father began to follow her while we, in my mother's arms, waited to see what would happen. Beyond the wheat field was a river. My father reached the river, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. She couldn't have crossed the river, so where did she disappear to? My father returned. He was pale. He looked at my mother and simply told us to keep walking. While my mother was telling this story, I jumped out of my chair and said that I always thought I had dreamed it, and that this dream had haunted me for years, because I still remember it as clearly as day. My mother said that it really did happen, and from that day, she no longer looked at the world the same way. My father was as pale as he was that day, terrified by the mere thought of the event.